We're continuing with Magic Eyes Only, Earth's Encounters with Extraterrestrial Technology by Ryan S. Wood. No chapters in here, just events. San Antonio, New Mexico, United States of America, 1945. Reem Baca and Jose Padilla were young boys living in San Antonio, New Mexico in August 1945 when, they say, they literally stumbled across the remains of what they believed to have been an alien spacecraft. Their personal account of the case displays many of the key ingredients of crashed UFO lore. Reem Baca recalls that New Mexico in 1945 was more like the third world than middle-class America, a state where a very small percentage of the population controlled a very large amount of the wealth, while about 80% lived at or below the poverty line. Baca's father was a sharecropper responsible for the crops from tilling to harvest, for which he got a small share. Jose Padilla's family lived on a ranch to the south of the town, in a traditional adobe house with a well in front of the yard and a nice shiny pickup truck that Jose was allowed to drive since he was the only male in the family not serving in the armed forces at the time. San Antonio, a small desert town on the main highway between Albuquerque and El Paso, Texas, is located some 20 miles northwest of the Trinity site where the first atomic bomb was tested on July 16, 1945. Jose was 9 years old when he and his mother, Inez, experienced the birth of the nuclear age at Trinity. Inez had just seen her husband Faustino, off to work. Jose was drinking a cup of hot chocolate when the flash, the sustained roar, and heat wave came. When his mother peeked through the door at the light of the flash, she sustained permanent loss of sight in one eye. It was not until 3 weeks later, on August 6th, that the terrified residents of San Antonio learned, along with the rest of the world, that the Trinity event was not a mishap involving an ammunition magazine containing high explosives and pyrotechnics, as the military had reported. It was an atomic bomb, also referred to as Death, the Destroyer of Worlds, in the words of project physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. In this atmosphere of suspicion, denial, and apathy born of fear, a small contingent of the U.S. Army passed almost unnoticed through San Antonio in the latter part of August of 1945 on a secret assignment. Little or nothing has been printed about the mission, but the military detail apparently came from White Sands Proving Grounds to the east. It was a recovery operation destined for the Mesquite and Greasewood Desert, west of old U.S. Highway 85, at what is now milepost 139, the San Antonio exit of present-day Interstate 25. There, over the course of several days, according to Baca and Padilla, soldiers in army fatigues loaded the shattered remains of a flying apparatus onto a huge flatbed truck and hauled it away. That such an operation took place between August 20th and August 25th, 1945, there is no doubt, Baca says. He and Jose were looking for a lost cow when they accidentally came upon the crash site. What we saw was a long, wide gash in the earth, with a manufactured object lying cockeyed and partially buried at the end of it, surrounded by a large field of debris. We believed then, and believe today, that the object was occupied by distinctly non-human life forms which were alive and moving about on their arrival minutes after the crash. They reported their findings to Jose's father Faustino, on whose ranch the craft had crashed. Shortly thereafter, Faustino received a military visitor asking for permission to remove it. During their school years, Baca and Padilla would sometimes whisper about the strange events, but they didn't talk to others about it on the advice of parents and a friend in the state police. In time, they grew up and moved away. Baca to Tacoma, Washington, and Padilla to Rowland Heights, California. They lost touch with each other and never discussed the significance of what they had seen, even as tales of UFOs and aliens encounters multiplied across the country. More than 4 decades later, in the year 2002, they were brought together through the internet. Baca had been doing research on his genealogy and made contact with Jose's son, who provided him with Jose's phone number. It was then that their mutual interest in the most intriguing event of their childhood was rekindled. Baca and Padilla combined their memories of that long-ago event, and a remarkable picture emerged. Baca writes, "In pungent but pleasing aroma of greasewood was in the air as Jose and I set out on horseback one August morning in 1945 to find a cow that had wandered off to calf. Despite minor perils associated with being away from adults, it was a routine outing for us. We decided to tether the horses as the terrain seemed too rough for their hooves. As we moved along, grumbling about the thorns, the building thunderheads decided to let go. We took refuge under a ledge above the floodplain, protected somewhat from the lightning strikes that suddenly peppered the area. The storm passed, and as we began to move out, another brilliant light accompanied by a crunching, rumbling sound shook the ground around us. The sound seemed to come from the next canyon. Jose noticed smoke coming from a draw adjacent to Walnut Creek, a main tributary from the mountains to the Rio Grande. We headed towards it, walking down towards the bottom of the hill. The ground was hot from the weather and the humidity. The first thing we saw was a kind of giant-sized gouge, like when a road grader goes in with a blade about 100 feet wide, deeper than a foot and a good football field long. It was scary. The gouge crossed this old road. Jose pulled out his binoculars, and through them he could see that the gouge ran into a ridge and then stopped. We could see that there was something there, an object that had dug itself into the sandy soil. The dust and heat were unbearable. We retreated briefly, then returned. Worried that there might be casualties in the wreckage, Jose convinced me that everything was going to be all right. He led the way. I followed. I asked if it might be an airplane. Jose said, "I don't think so." Things got eerie as we began examining the remnants of the periphery of a huge litter field. I picked up a piece of thin, shiny material that reminded me of the tinfoil in the old olive-green Philip Morris cigarette packs, the brand my mom smoked at the time. It was folded up and lodged underneath a rock. When I freed it, it unfolded all by itself. I refolded it and spread it itself out again. We finally worked our way to within yards of the wreckage, fearing the worst and not quite ready for it. It was tough walking through there. We were short guys. I had my hand over my face, peeking through my fingers. Jose, being older, seemed able to handle it better. Jose described what he saw through his binoculars. 3 strange-looking creatures moving fast, seemingly under stress, shadowy, almost as if they could will themselves from one position to another. They seemed not to be able to hold their balance. We were 100 to 200 feet from them. Sounds were coming out of the object, like a jackrabbit in pain, or like a baby crying. Really sad. Jose wanted to get closer. I wanted no part of it. Jose wasn't afraid of much, but I told him we should get out of there. I just had this feeling. We could see that there was a very large piece missing from the craft, and pieces of metal scattered around several hundred feet. It was getting late, so we backtracked. It was dark when we reached the Padilla home. Jose's dad got a brief report on the object, and the Hombrecitos, little guys, "We'll check it out in a day or two," Faustino said, apparently not worried in the least about survivors or medical emergencies. "It must be something the military lost, and we shouldn't disturb it." 2 days later, at about noon, said policeman Eddie Apodaca, the family friend who had been summoned by Faustino, arrived at the Padilla home. We directed Apodaca and Jose's dad toward the crash site in 2 vehicles, and a pickup truck. No. I'm just adding words. What the fuck? We directed Apodaca and Jose's dad toward the crash site in 2 vehicles, a pickup and a state police car. Well, I guess I was right, but I'm just adding words. When they could drive no further, they parked and hiked to the overlook where we had initially spotted the wreckage. For a second time, we were dumbfounded. The wreckage was nowhere to be seen. "Somebody must have taken it," Jose said defensively. We headed down the canyon nonetheless, and suddenly, as if by magic, the object reappeared. Apodaca and Faustino led the way to the craft, then climbed inside while we were ordered to stay a short distance away. The huge field of litter appeared to have been cleaned up. The main body of the craft, however, remained in place, with odd pieces dangling everywhere. We didn't hear any sounds of the Hombrecitos anymore. When Apodaca and Faustino came out of the object, they had a different attitude. They appeared more serious now. "Listen carefully. Don't tell anyone about this," Faustino said. Reem, your dad just started working for the government. He doesn't need to know anything about it. It might cause him trouble. The government calls them weather balloons," Apodaca said. "They'll want this thing back." "But this isn't like any weather balloon we've seen before," I said. "And the Hombrecitos?" "Maybe you just thought you saw them," Faustino said. "Or maybe somebody took them, or they just took off." We headed home. The recovery operation started about 2 days after our visit to the site. It was then that a Latino sergeant named Avila arrived at the Padilla home. We joined Faustino in the conversation with the soldier. Sergeant Avila said to Faustino, "I have been sent here by the United States Army to get your permission to tear down part of the fence adjoining the cattle guard on your property. We need to install a metal gate in order that we may drive a flatbed truck to recover one of our experimental weather balloons that was reported to have accidentally crashed there." Avila said Faustino reached an agreement on the recovery, and the soldier left. It wasn't long before the army was on the scene with road-building equipment. Although we were warned by Faustino to stay away, Jose and I sometimes watched from our hiding places, sharing a pair of binoculars as the military graded a road and soldiers prepared for the flatbed's arrival. Before the road was graded, however, soldiers were at the site carrying scraps of the mangled airship to smaller vehicles that were able to immediately get close. According to Jose, 4 soldiers were stationed at the wreckage at all times, with shift changes every 12 hours. The soldiers would throw some of the pieces of material down a crevice so they wouldn't have to carry them up the hill, I guess. Then they would kick dirt, rocks, and brush over them. Once the flatbed was in place, the soldiers used winches and a crane to hoist the intact portion of the wreckage into an L-shaped frame that was tilted to fit the object into the trailer. The ripped portion of the craft was on the bottom outside of the frame. The object was covered with a tarp and prepared to haul away. Lying in a trench, we observed all of this. When the soldiers left, we took a closer look. The object appeared larger than when we had first discovered it. We hadn't seen the part that was underground. Jose untied some of the ropes while I held the canvas. Then he climbed in. Finding a piece of pipe, he used that to undo a piece of metal about a foot long, and handed it to me. It reminded me of an ancient sundial that I had seen in some school books. A very light and cold piece of metal. We went back down the hill, climbed on our horses, and headed for home. Off the object went, shrouded under tarps through San Antonio, and presumably to Stallion Site on what is today White Sands Missile Range. 2 weeks after the recovery, 4 soldiers showed up on the Padilla Ranch, searching the road where the object had been loaded onto the trailer, as if they were looking for something. They did not make this known to Faustino Padilla. As this was taking place, Jose brought the piece we had taken. As this was taking place, Jose brought the piece we had taken to me, saying he did not want to get his dad in trouble with the government. If the soldiers found it on their premises, we buried it in the corner under the flooring in the old house that my dad used for storage. According to Jose, the soldiers came to their house and went through room by room looking for something. They asked Faustino if he had anything that might belong to them. He directed them to a room in the back of the house, a storage room where he kept weather balloons he had found. The soldiers went through and checked everything, including voter registration papers. They took with them the weather balloons and other odds and ends that they found. A piece of apparent crash debris retrieved from the site by Reem Baca and Jose Padilla had since been subjected to independent scientific analysis and is still the subject of additional planned studies, Baca explains. Since the research had not yet been completed, we have agreed to maintain the confidentiality of the facilities and scientists who are involved. In addition to local tests conducted in Washington state, we began working with Dr. Smith of the Metallurgy Department at an international facility when 3 different scanning electron microscopes were used to look at the metals and analyze their elemental makeup. The first thing we found was that the metal appears to be essentially an aluminum silicate. However, right from the onset, Dr. Smith pointed out the unusually high percentage of carbon. Later, we cut some samples and polished others in order to take a more detailed look. We got some great pictures of very weird structures in the metals. They look like little skeletons of bugs squashed into the metal. Also, there are short strands of some other material that we believe may be carbon fibers. This sort of hairiness about the metal provoked a lot of questions from the academics and electron microscope operators. Our next step was to get further analysis from a separate laboratory and different people, including a geneticist and a scientist with a metallurgical background. Their analysis confirmed what we had seen in the first results. There is certainly something unusual about the metal. Our analysis demonstrated the ability of this metal to transfer heat from one end to the other, thus preventing or retarding meltdowns, a bit like the tiles on the space shuttle. It apparently does not melt when subjected to 2,000-degree flame from an oxyacetylene torch for up to 2 minutes. Despite the fact that aluminum silicate would be expected to melt at about 700 degrees, and this sample being eutectic in nature, a form of material with the lowest possible melting point, I guess that's what eutectic means, should melt at closer to 500 degrees within seconds. A blend of carbon and some other trace materials is used which dramatically increases the conducting power, eliminating the resistance to electricity, while at the same time a transference of heat takes place. There appears to be the potential for heat shielding or computer chip manufacturing. Baca and Padilla say they are planning an expedition to investigate and unearth the remains of whatever crashed in the desert near San Antonio in August 1945. Was it just a weather balloon or something far more mysterious, worthy of recovery by a clandestine military operation? Baca and Padilla intended to prove that it was an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Here's some of the notations. Born on the edge of Ground Zero, living in the shadow of Area 51, Remigo Baca and Jose Padilla, 2005. I guess that's a book of theirs. It is not clear how close Jose and Reem were to the crash site or military perimeter. Either they were very lucky not to be discovered by the military perimeter guards, or they were very far away. On to the next. Arkansas, November 1946. According to a former U.S. Army Air Force private stationed at Wright Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio, a UFO crashed and was recovered by the military in Arkansas in November 1946. Space expert and investigator Clark C. McClelland, former SCO Space Shuttle Fleet, Kennedy Space Center, Florida, 1958 to 1992, was able in 1999 to secure the testimony of the private who described witnessing a recovered disc that was being stored in Building 18, not yet the famous Hangar 18 at Wright-Patterson. The private said he was delivering documents to the building when a friend from his unit who was standing guard asked him if he wanted to see a strange craft stored in the building. He followed the guard inside, and to his surprise, a disc-shaped object was sitting on the deck. It was 15 feet in diameter and about 7 feet in height. He said it looked like two soup bowls sealed together. Circling the perimeter of the disc was an 18-inch divider with 10 by 15-inch rectangular windows to set about 8 to 10 inches apart. The guard told the private that several scientists were attempting to gain entry into the interior. They tried to use a diamond drill to penetrate the glass, but the drill had no effect on the clear material. There were no visible doors or entry hatches, no insignias or flags, no writing or numbers. The structure appeared to be one continuous mold of a material, like brushed aluminum, though it wasn't. The craft had no visible weld seams, no rivets, no apparent joints in the skin. The guard and private both looked through the windows into the interior and did not see anything recognizable. No control panels, no seats, no hatches, no entities, nothing. A cylinder about 3 feet in diameter stood in the center. Its side wall was about 6 feet from the windows. The witness surmised that it might house the power unit. The Wright-Patterson base commander at the time was none other than Colonel Nathan F. Twining. As a general later in his career, Twining was clearly involved in the UFO topic. For example, in August 1954, he approved Air Force Regulation 200-2, which declared that the UFO phenomenon is something real, not imaginary or fictitious. Twining also figured in several Majic documents, notably the 19th page White Hot report dated September 24th, 1947. Actual title of which is Mission Assessment of Recovered Lenticular Aerodyne Objects and Implications in 5 parts. These parts were 1. Intelligence Estimate 2, Technical Evaluation 3, Scientific Probabilities 4, Political Considerations, and 5. National Security Structure. Twining would later become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Next instance, Pagos Indian Reservation, Arizona, 1947. Following a lead provided by UFO investigator and author Bill Hamilton in 1980, Leonard Stringfield spoke by phone with principal witness W.H. concerning an event occurred in January 1947 at the Pagos Indian Reservation north of the rugged Superstition Mountains near Globe, Arizona. Stringfield recorded the following details. W.H. was on temporary leave from the Navy, waiting for reassignment, when he and his friend C.C., just out of the Army, took a scouting trip in a Jeep to look for deserted property to homestead. Toward dusk, around 5 p.m., they were following a dirt trail when they came upon a group of Air Force personnel armed with carbines. They were ordered to stop and show identification, then questioned regarding their reason for being in the area. While stopped for questioning, W.H. could make out other military personnel about a quarter of a mile away, grouped around an object appeared to be half sunk in the sand. W.H. describes the object as disc-shaped with a dome on top, about 30 feet in diameter and 18 feet high. On its outer edge, he said, were 2 rings that seemed to have windows in between. In W.H.'s opinion, the military had just arrived on the scene. There was no evidence of an encampment or any heavy equipment, he told Stringfield. Next instance, Nogal Canyon, New Mexico, United States of America, May 1947. On January 13, 1995, Reg Presley, the lead singer with the British rock band The Trogs, was interviewed on British television and revealed that he had then recently viewed a remarkable segment of film footage. It allegedly showed the autopsy of an extraterrestrial body recovered from the wreckage of a UFO that had been found near White Sands, New Mexico in the early summer of 1947. Supposedly, the film was shot by a still-living elderly cameraman that had served in the Army Air Force at the time of the incident. In the weeks that followed, as pressure mounted to give the film a public airing, it was disclosed that the footage was held by a man named Ray Santilli, who was described by the London Daily Mail newspaper as an English entrepreneur whose business is making videos. Regarding his acquisition of controversial footage, Santilli explained, as a result of research into the film material for the music documentary, I was in Cleveland, Ohio in the summer of 1993. While there, I had identified some old film material taken by Universal News in the summer of 1955, and since Universal News no longer existed, I was able to determine that the film I wanted was shot by a then local freelance cameraman. He had been employed by Universal News because of a film union strike in the summer of 1955. The cameraman was located, and what followed was a very straightforward negotiation for a small piece of film, i.e. cash for 3 minutes of film. Upon completion of this transaction, the cameraman asked if I would be interested in purchasing outright very valuable footage taken during his time in the armed forces. He explained that the footage in question came from the Roswell crash, that it included debris and recovery footage, and, of most importance, autopsy footage. Santilli asserted that the specific location of the crash site was a Mescalero Indian Reservation near White Sands. The cameraman himself, whose identity has been carefully concealed to this day, allegedly complained the circumstances of the filming. I remember I got the call telling me to immediately report to Major General Clements McMullen. When I got to McMullen, I was told that a plane had come down just outside Socorro, New Mexico. A flight was being laid on to go down there, and I was to be on it. I was told to film the crash site and stay with the team, nothing else. I flew out of Andrews with the team, mainly medical, I think. We stopped at Wright Field to pick up other officers and men changing planes, and flew down to Roswell Air Base. We had a lot of equipment with us. After the flight, we traveled by road and dirt track to the site. I filmed the crash site, also the poor freaks, and we were told to keep back. I filmed the vehicle itself and the area around it. I felt nervous of something I could not understand or explain. There were injured creatures lying around, obviously in pain, but the men at the site were too scared to get close. Oh, there was a great deal of confusion until we arrived. My authority allowed me to operate as an independent as long as I didn't interfere with the cleanup. When I arrived, I set up my tent and equipment, and once I had the light, I started shooting. How did I feel about it? I was concerned about potential contamination, but I had no choice. Most of the processing took place around August. By that time, the military as we knew it ceased to be. The Air Force and the Army were about to split, and my unit was about to be disbanded for a time anyway. In fact, you could say I was in a strange position for a time, of not belonging to either one service. Then eventually they found a home for us. I took all the film because I had no one to report to. My orders were not to discuss the situation with anyone unless they brought up the subject first. The first batch had been delivered, then the department folded and I had no one to deliver to. I tried to contact McMullen, but I couldn't get through. In the end, I couldn't leave it lying around, so I took it home, which is where it stayed. According to Santilli, the cameraman insisted that he reached the crash site on May 31st, 1947, dating this incident more than a month before Roswell. An intriguing comment that may have a bearing on this case comes from the British researcher Ginny Randeles, who in 1986 contacted by a former British Army source who claimed to have access to photographs of an alien body, the description of which sounded very much like the body seen in an alien autopsy film, according to Randles. Bear in mind, 1986 was years before the autopsy film surfaced. In fact, the connections with an autopsy film and with what Robert told me are chillingly similar. One of the impressions that you get from viewing the alien autopsy footage is that the body is very human-like and is around 5 foot in height. I have to say, it struck me as soon as I saw the footage that this was very similar to what Robert had described. There is also the little-known fact that the British researcher Philip Mantle had the opportunity on 28th April 1995 to view a piece of film footage at Ray Santilli's London office, which was strikingly similar in nature to the widely publicized film, but that related to the autopsy of another. Unusual body, Mantle stated. The alien is humanoid, almost human-looking with an enlarged abdomen, 2 arms, 2 legs, but it has 6 digits on each of its hands and feet. There is no hair visible anywhere. The head is slightly enlarged, but it has a nose, mouth, ears, and 2 dark eyes. Female genitals are also visible. The alien's body is cut open and various organs are removed and placed in various receptacles. The people conducting the autopsy are completely covered in protection suits of some kind, and unfortunately the faces of these individuals are not visible. Ray Santilli would later explain that this second piece of footage was not released due to the graphic dissection of the creature's genitalia. In the decade that has now passed since the alien autopsy film surfaced, debate has raged as to whether it is an ingenious special effects hoax, the real thing, or the autopsy of a human being with an unusual physical disorder. Philip Mantle is an acknowledged expert in the analysis of the film. His conclusion now is that the preponderance of evidence favors authenticity primarily because there are now many witnesses that saw the film in an official military or governmental capacity before it was exposed to the public in 1995. However, intriguing new data has surfaced on the case from investigators Wendy Connors and Ed German that may point to the actual location of the crash site as described by the cameraman. Although Santilli mentions the Mescalado Reservation as the crash site, German went back to the cameraman's original crash location description and retraced the cameraman's steps. His conclusion is a different place, the entrance to Nogales Canyon, New Mexico. In the summer of 2002, Gutterman, a journalist and former special education teacher, uncovered, along with his brother, what they considered to possibly be the crash site. In September 2004, Wendy Connors accompanied German to the location, which she said lies southwest to Socorro, at the entrance to Nogales Canyon, a popular geological area for rock collectors and an isolated area. It takes approximately 45 minutes to reach the site after leaving Socorro, Connors added. There are 2 roads which lead to the site. One is more recent that can be used easily, but the older road allegedly used by the cameraman is no longer used except by local ranchers who lease the land for their cattle from the United States Bureau of Land Management. Before descending into the alleged crash site area, which is below the Bianchi Ranch, to the southeast approximately 1 mile, we came to the old homestead, which is no longer used. The Bianchi Ranch lies above the canyon area and is the last area with structures prior to entering the alleged crash site. Following the road next to the Bianchi Ranch, we descended into the Arroyo Canyon area. More interesting of all, according to Connors, upon entering the site, I encountered trees that appeared to have been burned from the top and burn marks ending before the ground. General layout of the area appears to closely resemble the drawings made by the cameraman. Most noticeable is the splattering of what appears to be a bluish-green concentration of mineral over the rock faces composing the crater of the site. The material appearance is much like hot wax having been splattered over the area. The substance at certain places appears to have been melted over the rocks. I took various specimens from the site. Since I have yet to have these specimens analyzed independently, I will defer judgment as to what the mineral-appearing material may be at this time. Ed Gutterham and Wendy Connors continued their efforts to authenticate the UFO crash site of late May 1947 at the entrance to Nogal Canyon, New Mexico. Bit of a short one. Well, on to the next event. Maury Island, Washington State, USA, June 21st, 1947. One reviewer of Ken Thomas's authoritative book on the event of 21st June 1947 at Maury Island, titled Maury Island UFO, wrote that it contained information rich to the point of saturation. There can be little doubt that Thomas has provided the clearest available picture of the curious events at issue. The Maury Island story began 3 days before the far better known sighting by pilot Kenneth Arnold of a number of elliptical-shaped objects over Mount Rainier, Washington State on 24th June 1947, an event that made international headlines and is widely regarded as the starting point of the modern UFO era. Not far away on the morning of 21st June, a lumber salvager named Harold Dahl, his son, and two still unidentified individuals witnessed 6 disc-shaped aircraft, one in the middle wobbling in a strange fashion, while the other objects surrounded it, flying in formation over Puget Sound, Tacoma, at a height of around 2,000 feet. Dahl describes the objects as being shaped like donuts, with 5 portholes on their sides. Suddenly, the central disk began to wobble even more and dropped to a height of no more than 700 feet. The remaining disks then broke formation, with one of them descending to the same height as the apparently malfunctioning disk and then proceeded to touch it. Without warning, the distressed disk began to spew forth what appeared to be 2 different substances, a material that Dahl described as a thick white newspaper-like metal that floated down to the bay, and a black substance that also hit the water and was reportedly hot enough to cause steam to rise. Sections of the black substance reportedly hit both Dahl's son and his pet dog, also on the boat, killing an animal outright. According to the story, Dahl reported the events in question to a man described as his superior, Fred Chrisman, a man with a long and complicated life story and suspected ties to the world of U.S. intelligence. Since Dahl had supposedly retained samples of the recovered debris, he convinced Chrisman to go to Maury Island shore and take a look for himself. Chrisman would later claim that he saw on the shore an enormous amount of both the black and white material and recovered some of it for his own safekeeping. Chrisman reported his experience to the publisher Ray Palmer of Amazing Stories fame, who hired none other than Kenneth Arnold to investigate the Maury Island affair. Arnold delved deep into the affair and was later joined by 2 Air Force investigators, Captain William Lee Davidson and First Lieutenant Frank Mercer Brown, who were working under General Nathan Twining to collect information on the then current wave of UFO encounters that were being reported across the United States. Chrisman turned over samples of the mysterious debris collected at Puget Sound to the Air Force investigators, who intended to take it to Wright Field, Ohio. Fate, who chose another outcome, however. Shortly after Brown and Davidson departed from Washington State, their plane crashed, killing both men. A team was dispatched to clean up the site. Reportedly, the strange debris could not be located. Many commentators, including Captain Edwards Ruppelt of Project Blue Book fame, have stated that the entire Maury Island event was nothing more than an unfortunate hoax that had a tragic outcome for Brown and Davidson. However, Ken Thomas's intense and dedicated research has shown that the affair might not be so black and white as has previously been assumed. More significant are Chrisman's links with the intelligence community. In 1968, Fred Chrisman was subpoenaed by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison as part of Garrison's investigation into the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Moreover, according to the Majestic 12's first annual report, Annex C, some of the debris from Maury Island was turned over by Chrisman, referred to as CIC or Counterintelligence Corps agent, to a CIA agent named Shaw, the annual report states. The death of two Air Force counterintelligence officers in the crash of their B-25 aircraft en route to Hamilton Air Force Base, California, after interviewing two auxiliary CG men who reported 6 UFOs over Maury Island, Washington in June 1947. CIC agent Chrisman had spoken to Kenneth Arnold, who on June 26, 1947, had reported a flight of UFOs over Mount Rainier, Washington, and filed a report after he had spoken to Captain Davidson and Lieutenant Brown. The material given to Davidson and Brown was believed to come from Maury Island, and may be celestial fragments containing metal from a nuclear reactor from a UFO. Fragments were turned over to CIA agent Shaw, and Chrisman was ordered to an Alaskan Air Defense Command for assignment in Project Ivy. Ken Thompson suggests that this was Clay Shaw, one of 3 people that Jim Garrison attempted to indict during his quest for the truth surrounding the JFK assassination. And although Shaw was eventually acquitted, his role as a CIA asset has since been well documented and admitted officially by the CIA. For his part, Garrison claimed that his prosecution of Shaw was a toehold to a larger conspiracy in which Fred Chrisman may have been an assassin working on behalf of the aerospace industry, which had its own reasons for wanting JFK dead. In a well-known report titled The Torbit Document, Chrisman is named as one of the 3 hobos picked up in the rail yard behind the infamous grassy knoll at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, where some maintain a second gunman was located during the killing of Kennedy. The fog of time has effectively resulted in certain aspects of the Maury Island case remaining unsolved, perhaps permanently. For some, the case is still nothing but a tragic hoax. For others, however, it is seen as one of the most important cases of all, involving the actual recovery of debris from a malfunctioning UFO, the case involvement of shadowy players on the periphery of the intelligence community, the possible deliberate murder of Air Force personnel in possession of the strange materials recovered at Maury Island, and even direct or indirect links to the JFK assassination. This is one crash retrieval case that is far from being labeled case closed. Last event. Plains of San Augustine, New Mexico, USA, July 1947. The genesis of the tale that a UFO crashed and was recovered along with its dead crew of alien creatures in the plains of San Augustine, New Mexico, in early July 1947, can largely be traced back to L.W. Vern Maltias and his wife Jean, who in turn got the story from their friend Grady Barney Barnett. The Malteses approached a UFO investigator The Malteses approached UFO investigator Stanton Friedman after a lecture at Bemidji State College, Minnesota in 1978. Friedman, assisted by researcher William Moore, began piecing together Barnett's story from Verne and Jean's testimony. Later, they would find additional sources. Barney Barnett was a veteran of World War I and a solid citizen regarded by all who knew him. In 1947, he was a civil engineer working for the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. In June of that year, according to the Malteses, he literally stumbled upon the remains of a wrecked saucer and deceased occupants in the desert near the town of Magdalena, New Mexico, specifically on the plains of San Augustine. Barnes informed his friends that the saucer was pretty good sized and that the bodies of the crew were scattered around. The broken objects were small, with pear-shaped heads and small eyes. All were dressed in gray suits. Barnett said he was only at the crash site a short time before he was joined by a group of archaeologists, all of whom wondered what they should do next. Suddenly, the military arrived on the scene and made it clear what they should do next: swear themselves to silence, as the event was one that had a major bearing on U.S. national security. Robert Drake, an anthropology student in 1947, claimed to have heard rumors pertaining to this case and stated that a Roscoe Willamette of the Los Alamos National Laboratory had read files at the facility that may have had a bearing on the affair. Barney Barnett had also quietly told his boss, Fleck Danley, the day it happened, and later his wife's niece, Alice Knight Friedman, and the other researchers had spoken with both Danley and Knight. According to Stanton Friedman, I located a neighbor who had lived across the street from Barney and who not too long before Barney died of cancer had asked Barney where he got the cancer. Barney indicated it probably came from his closeness to alien bodies out on the plains. A postmistress and an old-time rancher on the plains had heard of the recovery of a crashed saucer way back when out on the plains. The military officer William Lead had contacted Barney because of Lead's commander had told him that Barnett had been at a saucer crash site. Barnett would only talk to him after Lead had shown his military credentials. Lead was satisfied that Barney was honestly telling his story of bodies next to an almost intact vehicle. Ruth Barnett's niece, Alice Knight, had located Ruth's diary for 1947 and shared it with researchers. There were many entries for the summer of 1947 indicating that Barney was working out on the plains, or as she sometimes referred to it, the high country. Although there was no specific diary entry by Ruth about a crashed saucer in the plains, it is clearly a credible scenario given the other facts. What does seem indisputable is that Barney Barnett informed Verne and Jean Maltias of the story long before the details of the so-called Roswell incident surfaced many years later. The Roswell case occurred in virtually the same time frame as Barnett's encounter has. The Roswell case occurred in virtually the same time frame as Barnett's encounter and has many eerie parallels to this event. And we'll pick up the Roswell one tomorrow.